I was one of the first people on this stage to put out a gun safety policy. This is important to me. I grew up in Wayne County. My grandfather taught me how to use firearms when I was 4 years old. So I learned the power and the safety of, what responsible gun use and ownership ought to be. That's something we've gotten away from in this country. We need to pass universal background checks. They passed the House of Representatives in H.R. 8. They need to pass the Senate. Mitch McConnell needs to get off his butt and get the job done. We ought to close all gun purchasing loopholes. There are a ton of them, at least 8 to 10 right now, that ought to be off the books, right? So those are two things we can do right now. We need to reinstitute the federal assault weapons ban that sunsetted in the 2000s, right? It's been at least 15 years since that happened, and it is time to bring that back. We need to fully fund CDC research into gun violence as an epidemic in this country. It is a long process. And then the last thing I'll say is, look, we have some compared to the rest of the country, pretty strong gun safety laws here in New York State. So when I talk to firearm owners and hunters in this state, especially in this district, they're very concerned that you're going to come get their guns, right? And that could not be farther from the truth. I mentioned my grandfather was a lifetime NRA owner. I think my dad just recently gave up his membership after a lifetime as well. We need to bring the rest of the country up to the standards that we have set here in New York State. And I think the fifth thing I'll say, my plan had 5 parts if you're counting, it's okay if you weren't. The fifth thing is we need to get to universal licensing for gun purchases, right? You have to have a license to drive a car. You ought to have a license across this country to purchase a firearm, right? You ought to take a mandatory gun safety course to prove that you're proficient before you can have it, right? We do it for vehicles. We got to do it for firearms. And the last and most important piece is it is not enough for us to sit and demand action from the sidelines, which is why this fall I'll be going to Wayne County Scope and other groups here in Cayuga County, gun advocacy groups, to bring my plan to them. Because if you haven't noticed in the last 15 years since the federal assault weapons ban sunset, we haven't gotten anywhere on this issue. And we sit here and we yell across the valley at one another. But we need to actually get things done. Because I'm not waiting around for my 2 kids to be the victim of gun violence before we get serious about this. So I'm going to go to them and let them yell, but really talk to them as human beings and say, you talked about, Susan, getting how do we bridge the gap? How do we close divisiveness? It's, again, showing up and sticking around, right? And it's about being proud and confident in our policies as Democrats and communicating that to people who disagree with us, and that's okay. That conversation is how we move this conversation forward and keep our kids safe, which for me, and I know for a lot of you, is the most important thing.